Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. My name is Stephanie. I'm a researcher and thank you. I'm a researcher and also a student. I'm really glad that TJC has organized this event. I think a lot of people look to religion for guidance on big issues, controversial issues, and I think that the intersection of the death penalty and religion has not been discussed enough. So I'm really glad to be part of this event. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. So we have Miak Siu Meng Yi, who is a pastor of Free Community Church, and he believes that the death penalty violates the sanctity of human life. We also have Yap Chin Wee. She's a social worker who wants to abolish the death penalty. She practices the Pure Land Amitabha recitation. Is that correct? Yeah. So we actually have a third speaker, Raihani Sarom. She's a legal consultant in immigration law and currently a part-time graduate student in migration and refugee studies. She's passionate about protecting the rights of the most vulnerable and is against the state having the right to take life under any circumstances. So unfortunately, Raihani can't be here in person, though she really wanted to, but she wants to share her views on her faith and position on the death penalty, so she's actually recorded a video.
Hi everyone, I'm Raihani Sahrom, and just a brief introduction. I'm a Shia Muslim and I consider myself an abolitionist. So firstly, thank you to Transformative Justice Collective for affording me this space to share my views, and I really wish that I could make it in person, but I've just been traveling for business. So hopefully this recording provides a little bit of insight and contributes to the overall conversation and discussion surrounding the death penalty. So to just start off, I would like to share the very basic Islamic concept is that the whole universe was created by Allah, which is simply Arabic for God, whom created man and appointed for each human being a fixed period of life that he is supposed to spend on this earth. So we have been prescribed a certain code of conduct of life, which is to stay away from the forbidden haram and adopt one that is just, not just to your fellow human beings, but one to yourself. At the same time, God has conferred upon everyone the freedom of choice as to whether or not we adopt this code as the actual basis of our lives. So Islam is most definitely the root of my politics, my ethics, discipline, the way I understand the world as well, and it deals with human rights, it deals with anti-apartheid liberation theology and transformative justice and so on. So we must understand that, of course, Islam is not just a homogeneous group, like all sharing the same beliefs. There is a lot of variation and interpretation of the faith. There are interpretation of the faith that regard the use of death penalty as permitted under Sharia law, but its application is only allowed in very, very limited circumstances. So for murder, for example, but also it has to ensure the highest requirements of due process and having regard to the overriding objective of Islam, which is justice, mercy, and repentance. So only if all of these considerations have been proven, which is essentially very, very hard to prove and justify death penalty. So although historically the Quran makes provision for the use of death penalty for murder, it also provides for other more favorable and recourses to justice, which include restitution and forgiveness. Ultimately, it is a very key belief that subjecting people to torture, to violence, it violates a social-religious responsibility in Islam. And mercy and humanity are so central to Islamic beliefs that so many times, even in our prayers, when we recite the Quran, we mention that Allah is Ar-Rahim, which is the most merciful. And aside from that, the Quran also even tells us to pay zakat in order to free people. So in this sense, it actually profoundly focuses on restorative justice rather than a punitive one. It is just so antithetical as well to incarceration and capital punishment. And this concept of mercy, is an act that Jewish people, Muslims, Christians, and believers in other traditions as well can deeply resonate with. We also have like the concept of accountability, which is muhasabah, retrospection, accounting, reckoning, and it is one of the core and important concept in Islam. And yeah, furthermore, like in Surah Ar-Ra'd as well, in the Quran, it mentioned that Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what it is in themselves. So apart from having to deeply recognize with our own behavior and be accountable for the harm that we may have enacted upon others, where we have been careless in our actions, words, and agreements, we are also responsible for other human beings and creations. And not only that, like we are accountable for them too, where we have acted unjustly towards them. So torture and incarceration, they are very antithetical to Muslim beliefs of being in a very like communal healing and focusing more on restorative justice. There definitely should be more conversations and discussions around death penalty in Muslim circles. I personally have been a part of several discussions globally, sometimes interfaith, but more so like surrounding the concept of fairness, justice, mercy, and forgiveness. So one of them during Ramadan, which is our fasting month last year, there was an international discussion on believers' bailout, where we were raising funds for bailouts. For Muslims who were incarcerated. It was also zakat eligible, wherein zakat, which is almsgiving, it is one of the key pillars of Islam. So even the Quran tells us to pay zakat in order to free people, like I've mentioned earlier on. So we were discussing on the emphasis in the Quran that is on mercy and forgiveness. So there should be exoneration in the event of doubt or repentance. There is strong evidence that such punishment, like including the death penalty, were prescribed to act as a deterrent and not to be so like liberally applied in practice, because whether one agrees with death penalty should ever be used or not, it is hard to see how its widespread application today could be considered compatible with Islamic jurisprudence and within like the Islamic traditions and beliefs. So my views personally surrounding carcerality have definitely evolved as I grow up. When I was really young, I was always like being told that I've been taught that the death penalty was about deterrence. Cultural ideas have always been instilled in us from a very young age. Like even when we were kids, right? When we did something wrong and then adults would say, oh, don't do that, or I'll call the police. And like even if they were not serious, like it's always being viewed as something that could stop us from doing things that was regarded as like bad. So when we also realized that crime essentially like it is a very socially constructed category with a variation of contested definitions of power relations that existed like years and years ago, and humans just keep adding on to it. And however, when we look at it, like essentially abolition is about societal shift in what justice looks like for us. So especially for the harmed and the victims, it's about abolishing like the environmental conditions that made that harm even possible in the first place. So through this, it seeks to create a new world where there will be less victims because you're tackling and addressing the root of the harm. So it's about community healing, as I've mentioned previously, accountability, muhasabah, redressing of trauma and harm, where approaches are victim-centered and trauma-sensitive and not responding to violence with state-sanctioned violence. I believe as an abolitionist Muslim as well, I believe that anti-oppression and abolition are very deeply intertwined in the struggles for justice. And abolition implies that human lives are not disposable or negligible. So that is why repentance is a very huge concept in Islam, where, of course, like all of us, we know like at some point of time in our life, we have definitely committed some harmful acts toward others, be it even if we know it or not, like we have to be accountable for that harm to them. So we have to like humanize and contextualize and look with compassion and mercy as per Islamic teachings. So to our loved ones who had committed harm, even to ourselves in the past as well, or even right now, if we are still sort of like in a way enacting harm upon others, where we may or may not be aware of, and we should always try to extend the same to strangers, not just to our loved ones, not just to ourselves. So I hope that what I've shared, hopefully contributed a bit to the discussion.
So Rayani, wherever you are, thank you for your very clear, strong voice and an inspiring video. So I'm going to invite our panelists, Miak and Ching Wei. Maybe you can respond to the sharing. Yeah.
I think coming from being a Christian and coming from Abrahamic faith, there's a lot of resonance with what was shared, right? I think, but I want to first lay some caveats. First, I want to say I speak as a Christian, but I don't speak on behalf of all Christians. This is where I arrive at in my faith journey, based on what I understand as the teachings in the Bible, what Jesus taught, and the character of God. This is how I understand it. Just like what was shared, not all Muslims may agree with her, not all Christians may agree with me, right? And I think the core on this it really depends on where our starting point is. I think the starting point is that all human beings are created in the image of God. That's basically what all the three Abrahamic faiths align there. Each of us carry the image of God. The core of Jesus' teachings and Jesus' commandment to love one another as I've loved you. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commandments, all the law and the prophets hang. How does the death penalty factor into love is the question, right? And that's how I arrive, and that's how I see it. And I want to hear also, like from Ching Wei, from a different faith, right? And I think that there might be some commonalities, even though, I'm from the Abrahamic faiths and, you are not from one of the Abrahamic faiths. I think there might be some resonances.
Definitely. Thanks, Miak. Detour to his caveat. It just changed Christianity to Buddhism. But yes, I am sharing what I know of Buddhism, and of course I'm injecting it with my own perspective and experience as a social worker. So, just listening to the short video, right? What resonated? There were so many words and terms, concepts, right? Like mercy, community healing, compassion, and not responding to violence with hate. So it gives me a lot of comfort and hearing what you said, right? So I think this represents a side of the faith perspective on death and death penalty, represents a side of the discourse that we need to bring more out of in the whole discussion of death penalty. So hopefully today we can inject and start the momentum.
I think Rayani in her video also talked a little bit about some shifts in the doctrine. So she put things in a little bit of a historical, social context. And I believe you'd mentioned that there are literal readings versus contextual readings, right? So could you speak a little bit to that about how we need to kind of see these changes in the historical and social context? Yeah.
The first book of the Bible is Genesis. And very early on, there's in Genesis 9 verse 6 is, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man, the human being, right? And so that justifies killing someone for murder. But that's rather ironic, right? It's kind of like, so you spill the blood because this person killed another person, and you go and kill this person. It doesn't make sense. How do we square that in some ways? And in the Old Testament, there are a lot of reasons to justify killing and stoning someone. But we have shifted away from that. There are a lot of perspectives in the past that was very valid, but no one will hold it to be true today. For example, the Bible has slavery in it, and the assumption that slavery is okay, right? And it's not until in very recent times, if you look at the historical context of Christianity as a religion, that slavery is no longer acceptable. I do not know a single Christian who says slavery is okay. Perspectives change based on our growing understanding of what is right, what is just, what is loving. We are continuing expanding our understanding of the divine and what is good. And we are moving away from that. We are moving away from violence. We are moving towards something that's more just, more loving. And I think that is a very important understanding. I think that, it shocks me that few Christians stand up and say something about, or Christian leaders in Singapore stand up and say much about the death penalty, because, hello, don't you know that Jesus was executed by the state in a very unjust way? Do we understand that the immensity of that, the power of the empire, of the people in the powerful ruling class controlling people based on this death penalty and punishment and power? The disciples of Christ, most of them were executed by the state one way or another. They were martyred. And with that understanding, then can we look at it in a different way? Of course, there will be Christians who say if there's no death penalty, then there's no crucifixion and blah, blah, blah. But let us I think we need to understand the cross used to be the symbol of death punishment. The cross is the noose today in our context. It is not a symbol of life. It's a symbol of death. And we need to reclaim that. We need to understand that we need to move beyond death, move beyond executing people, punishing people, to reach a place where there's restorative justice, there's healing, and understand what causes all this, what causes hate, what causes crime, and address those things. I think it's very important. Yeah. Ching, you want to add on before I go into a huge rant?
Okay, I'm just trying to find something that is about history and... So I think in history, Japan had 650 years of no capital punishment in its history. And I'm sure quite a lot of us will be familiar with King Ashoka, this Indian king from the 3rd century BCE, right? He went to war and he and his army killed 18,000 people. And then after that, he decided that, he will adopt non-violence. And he took up a lot of Buddhist practices. So he abolished death penalty. In addition, right, he put a restriction of killing of animals. And he actually constructed rest houses and wells every 800 meters along the road. So if I were to put that in its totality, right? If a society or the policies are motivated by wellness and compassion for the people, then we are looking at a series of policies, of which death penalty is one of it. And I really want to contextualize it, our discussion in this way, because a lot of times we just narrow in on death penalty, and then we get stuck into discussing issues of justice and whether it's fair, right? But I think later on, I'm sure we'll talk about it. One of the common aspects of the religions, right, is to focus on the cause as well as the effect, right? So now we are focusing too much on the effect, so hopefully, let's look at the cause. But since I still have the mic, right? Can I just share a few points about the Buddhist perspective of death penalty, because it's quite different. Yeah. So for Buddhists, right, it's about skillful means and the law of karma. So basically, there's no good or bad, right or wrong. An action is unskillful if it's rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. But if it's an action that brings benefit to self and others, then it is a skillful action. So there is this quote in one of the suttas, right, which I absolutely love. whatever action you desire to do with the body, mind, or speech, you should reflect, now, this action that I desire to do, would it harm me, harm others, or harm both me and others? Then, unskillful is this action, entailing suffering and production of pain. So, if we were to understand death penalty based on this, then obviously death penalty is very unskillful, right? So, I think I need to explain the law of karma a little bit, because otherwise it risks being seen as fatalistic, right? So, very simply put, karma is a bitch, like whatever you do, you will get it back, right? Not this life maybe, but next life, as how Buddhists believe, right? So in that sense, the notion of justice is there. But of course, in the whole interdependence of society and all the relationships, right? From the karma point of view, we are concerned that death penalty actually creates a lot more bad karma for all the parties involved, right? For the person that's going to be killed, can you imagine the mental suffering for that person's family members and friends? Actually, for the victim and the victim's family members as friends as well, right? Let's say somebody killed a family member, right? So I wish death on the murderer. But if this person died, my family member is also dead, and my family member cannot come back alive. Then there is all this mental suffering, and how does this then impact society as a whole? How does this impact our notion of compassion, and how can we develop the notion of justice, right? Hopefully it's developmental towards more and more just, towards more and more compassion, right? So as Miak says, like, as we evolve, our notions and our values definitely will adjust, yeah? So given the law of karma, and given how we understand and how we act based on what is skillful and what is not skillful, right? What is unskillful about death penalty? The first point is that you cannot create true happiness by making people suffer. The second point is death penalty makes revenge an essential part of the system, which we talked about, right? And it does not solve the problem for the individual. This is where I think we are all advocating for restorative justice, right? And finally, it doesn't solve the root of the problem, right? So if we have death penalty, but we don't look at the causes, and then there will forever be more and more death penalty, right? So it really doesn't make sense as a society. So yeah, I'll stop at there, and then we can.
I appreciate what Ching Wei said, and is we need to take a systemic view of the issue. It's interconnected with a lot of other issues as well. And we cannot examine death penalty without thinking about the structural things that are in place, the capitalistic society that we live in. And a lot of people think that, wow, woke speech, Miak very woke. But actually it is in the Bible, right? So when Jesus starts his ministry, he makes this proclamation that's quoted from Isaiah. And he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And, like, what is this? What is this year of the Lord's favor? In the Bible, there is this law that nobody practices called the Jubilee year. That's every 50 years, the land is returned to its original owners, the slaves are set free, no one can be sold to slavery in perpetuity, and the prisoners are set free. It is a reset of the system. So there are a few things that cannot happen. One, nobody can get extremely wealthy and accumulate a lot of wealth. The capitalistic system is actually abolished. And that is the understanding of the root of the issue. right? A lot of the problems we face is based on inequality. If everyone has enough, then who needs to steal? If everybody is thriving, then then a lot of things actually go away. If all of us are thriving and doing well, then crime rates will be really low. I think that we need to relook at our system and the problems that is, right? And I like what Ching Li said about vengeance, because I have seen, and there are many documentaries out there about people who have committed crimes, and then the victim had some relationship when the perpetrator actually becomes very remorseful, repent, and find a way to make amends to the victim. There's one story about a young man who shot, when he was, I think 11, he tried to rob a woman in the car park lot. And of course, he accidentally fired the gun and she got shot, but she didn't die. He got caught and he was thrown in jail for, I think, 20, 30 years. But they maintained a relationship. He wrote letters to her to apologize and that. And when he came out 20, 30 years later, now, because he went in when he was a kid, he came out in a totally different world. She helped him get used to life again. I think she taught him how to drive in the US. That restoration, that healing, is actually a very powerful story. If you punish and it's just vengeance, what kind of people will we create? Too often, the people who demand blood don't get that satisfaction when it happens, right? And it is the people on our bystanders like us who will be the ones who are like demanding, when we read the news about someone who did something really bad and got, some sentence, and we feel that yes, that person deserves it. It's our human nature of vengeance, but it doesn't do us any good. It's not merciful. It's not the character of the divine. It actually festers in us. I think that we are called to let go and forgive because it makes us more human, more loving, and builds a very different kind of society. I mean, Jesus says, you are told an eye for an eye. But I tell you, do not resist the evildoer, but turn the other cheek. It is not just passive, but it's also about who we are inside. I think that when we think about punishment, about restorative justice, we also need to think about the transformation. What kind of society are we if people do the right thing and don't do the wrong thing because of the fear of punishment? You're still a bad person, what? But what if we are a society that does the right thing, that don't do the wrong thing because of who we are? I think that's more important. I think all faiths are trying to change who we are. And my question will be, where is our starting point? Is our assumption that all people are inherently evil or bad? Or do we start from the point that all human beings are inherently good? But something happened along the way. And that is, if we start from that starting point, then what can we prevent them from falling, to the dark side, kind of thing?
Yeah, as you were saying, I recall one point that we talked about earlier, right? So this thing about using fear, we often read that Singaporeans need death penalty to deter, right? When we are trying to build a narrative to Singaporeans, right? We all know, right? The messages can only be simplified. And so then the people get it, and then you keep repeating it, and then it becomes truth. This thing about fear, again, I think it distracts us from looking at death penalty in its totality. And again, to balance up looking at causes rather than effect, right? As I was preparing for today, I actually talked to a few of my Buddhist friends, because I really want to hear what, different voices and perspectives, right? So this friend of mine, she's in her 40s. So this is what she says. Singapore rules by fear, and hence the mandatory death sentence. The death sentence is only part of what Singapore currently represents. And my wish for Singapore is a place that is filled with love and compassion, that true understanding, dialogue, and interaction is taking place, where there is respect for one and all, regardless of our differences and even our actions. So what I find so beautiful about this is that we put death penalty in this whole ecosystem of how we want our society to be, the values, right? But since the reality is such, right, that we have been living under the motivation or the detriment of fear, right? I want to share another view by a Buddhist youth who is an undergraduate. I'm very, very touched by what she shared because I didn't know this about her, okay? So her stand is the way to stop hatred is not with hatred, but of course with loving kindness and compassion. So she said that as someone who has childhood trauma, I can see how individuals who had difficult upbringings or who are stuck in difficult socio-economic situations are vulnerable and susceptible to crime. Instead of punishing them for society's inabilities, we should be more understanding and think of ways to target the actual root causes of these issues. This is a young 20-something-year-old Singaporean. So these two, well, basically, I'm really just trying to emphasize, right? Like if we were to look at death penalty from the causes of then who are the people that tend to commit crime? What are the main structural reasons that there is crime in the first place? Then it's obvious poverty, right? It's obvious unequal distribution of resources, right? The divide, the increasing divide between the rich and the poor. So if we were to bring back to the notion of justice, must we wait until someone kills someone, then we narrowly look at how justice is being played out? Or should we extend this whole notion of justice to people who are living, who are not dead, and that we really can work on making people's life better, fairer, and people can actually be so much more productive. So, yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about this, the cost aspect of death penalty.
I think sometimes when we have certain power to solve problems, we want to be seen doing something, right? We want to heed what people cry out for, but that may not necessarily be the right thing, right? When we see something that's wrong, you should do something, that person should be punished. And of course, there are times that the crimes are really, really painful to hear, and really, really, what we would say that, this is true evil. But, from a very Christian perspective is, the death penalty does not allow that person the opportunity to repent and to change. We have taken that away, if we exercise the death penalty. And so, I think that healing and the restoration happens when that person actually repents. And that's a very common word that we hear in Christianity: repent, change. You have done something wrong, you have committed a sin, repent, turn back. I think in Buddhism as well, I think in all faiths, they will tell you have done something wrong, you need to change. That inner change is what we are seeking. It is the easy way out to just punish and get over and done with. The reformation and the rehabilitation of the person is the struggle. That doesn't mean that someone, we might work very, very hard, that person is let out, and that person might re-offend again. That happens. But does that mean that we stop? Does that mean that we don't give people a second chance? And the death penalty is exactly that, not giving the person a second chance.
I am not denying the suffering of people who suffer injustice. I cannot imagine the pain, right? But I hope that we can pair the notion of justice with the notion of healing. How can justice happen without healing, right? Healing for the individual, like what we were saying, healing for the family members whose injustice was done on, right? And healing for the whole society. It's like, how does it make sense? How does it make us better or give us more peace of mind if more and more people are dying? In this case, if they are low-level drug mules. Like, yeah, it doesn't, you know. So why are we not talking about, or is it like these things like healing and all these things is like too soft and too whatever, huh? Is it like in the world of masculine men and patriarchy is too soft and, I don't know, pink color and lace? I don't know.
I think that we also need to think about when I'm in pain and I inflict pain on you, does it remove my pain? If I have been hurt and I go and hurt you, does it bring me healing? It doesn't, right? It is about, so healing comes about, I think if I'm in pain, the pain needs to be addressed. That's one. And also, if someone empathizes with my pain, acknowledges my pain, then I can be able to move on from my pain and hurt. That will help my process, right? Whatever that kind of pain and hurt it is. When the perpetrator recognizes the pain that, that they have inflicted on someone, on the victim, when they make amendments, that's when the healing can happen. That is the process that we need to look at. And helping all of us understand what we inflict on other people will help us, will prevent us from taking that action, right? Knowing that if I'm going to hurt you and understand that hurt, then I will be less inclined to do that.
So, what you say about, say, forgiveness, mercy, kindness, love, I mean, as a parent who also has to think about teaching consequences to my child, I can understand that healing and all that. But I'm just thinking about the intersection of compassion, empathy, and policy, right? So I've started law school and I'm studying criminal law, and all we do is technical application of the penal code, and the prosecutor has all these justifications for an efficient criminal justice system. And how do we then think about, on a larger scale, rather macro scale, when policymakers say, oh, but we need to regulate society in a certain way, and this is how it works. So how would you apply those broad principles to punishment, consequences, and crime control in general, not just in relation to the DP per se, but just in general, right? Because even within doctrines of where there's mercy, even in restorative justice, my understanding is not that it's without consequence, right? You still want to teach certain lessons. So if I wanted to apply broadly the values that you've mentioned to a certain way of regulating society, what would that way be? So let's say if I made you AG, the Attorney General, for example, right? Then how would you then implement some of those values and structure them into how we regulate society? And what do we do when someone does do something wrong that we all have a consensus that is wrong? Even against your religion doctrine, there are rights and wrongs, right? Yeah.
So you're asking us to provide consultation on policy making.
Not just policy, but I think sometimes...
Should we be given some fees or something?
Because universal values, people generally don't disagree, right? Who is going to disagree that I believe you should be compassionate or kind, or that generally we want a society that heals? The problem is when you face hard-nosed politicians who will, like Ching Wei said, dismiss this as very loosey-goosey, kind of non-implementable things. which I personally also don't believe, right? It's just that if we want to, if we acknowledge that yes, people, as humans, we're fallible, we do commit things that are wrong, and when you live in a society, there are sometimes consequences when you do commit a wrong. So how would you then translate those values to a certain way of regulating behavior if you don't believe in the carceral system?
So, I go first.
Yeah.
So society is interdependent, right? We don't need for the justice system to do everything. In fact, it can't, right? So then it starts from how parents bring up their children. It starts from how different faith communities exert onto the larger society. What are the values we want to uphold? What actions or what can we offer to make this happen, right? And so if we look at every level, there are so many possibilities, yeah? As you were saying, I suddenly realized what is my problem with the yellow ribbon campaign. It's yellow, right? It's
Yes, yellow.
many colors.
Yes, yellow.
So it's like it's plastered all over, right? Give people second chance, right? But how come after so many years we're still not giving people second chance? We're still hearing people, ex-convicts being discriminated at job interviews. So this is about employment laws, right? So at every level, you know, and I think this Yellow Ribbon campaign is very representative of us as a society. Just because we think we've done this and that, and then we say all the right thing, then can already. Because this is the lived reality of majority of us. Because the ex-convicts are always a minority. So they have to try so hard to let the majority know the kind of obstacles and the discriminations that they are going through, right? And this applies to so many other different minorities, right? So if I were to answer it in this way, then that I suppose the justice system is probably the last that we need to focus on in a way, because if other segments of society and other institutions, if we move towards these values of compassion and forgiveness, then it will all follow. I may not see it in my lifetime, but I'm really, really hoping that, you know, if there's anything else, a lot of young people here can make it happen. But I know it's so difficult, but I firmly believe that if a lot of people come out and say what is the society that we want to live in, and people actually do something about it, then it can happen. So that's the optimistic me.
I would look at the justice system that we currently have. We imagine that someone commits a crime, get thrown in jail, you know, maybe undergo some rehabilitation inside, whether it's going for class or what, you know, to do their time, come out and everything will be okay. That's the assumption. What will make things right? What will change their heart? What will change their situation so that they recognize the harm they have caused, the hurt they have inflicted on people, and what have they done wrong? I think that part needs to be rethought, right? Because our solution is always throw them in there, and that's it. But I think there needs to be more done in the rehabilitation work. How that looks like, it needs to be expanded a bit more. There are multiple projects that's ongoing, and I read about one judge in the US who's exploring different ways of sentencing to address the issue, and not just incarceration. It requires a reimagination of how things will look like. And I think that's the thing that we lack. We lack imagination of what is possible. We just do what has been done and assume that that way will work. We assume and assume. We operate and use fear. If you are using fear to rule, if there's no inner transformation, people will just go by what we always say in Singapore, right? You know, you can do anything you want, just don't get caught. I think it's more important to know what is inside ourselves that we shouldn't do this. And that's the way we should see it. I think it's an entire project that's not just hinged upon just the justice system or the prison system, but also about society at large, the capitalist society, how people who are disadvantaged and marginalized are continually disadvantaged and marginalized.
Can I make one last point, right?
Yes.
I just want to read a few paragraphs of this philosopher Nagarjuna in the 1st century BCE. This is part of his advice to the king. Just as a son is punished out of the desire to make him worthy, so punishment should be inflicted with compassion and not through hatred or greed. Once you have judged angry murderers, you should banish them without killing them. And then he went on to advise in quite a bit of details. You should particularly have compassion for those who have committed the serious negativity of murder. These ones who have ruined themselves are indeed worthy of a great person's compassion. And he asked the king to release prisoners as much as possible, and to provide for their welfare. He even go down to details like provide for them barbers and baths and food and drink and clothing and medical care. So the whole basis of it, right, is that if we take good care of them, not indulging them, but treat them as human beings, and if we work with them, right, then then there is meaning in the punishment. And then when they are out of the prison system, then they are on their way to become constructive members of society. Okay, so anyway, philosophers, I know philosophers these days, not a lot of people listen to them, so okay.
So we don't have a Catholic on the panel. So again, caveat, right? I won't speak and I can't speak for all Catholics. But Pope Francis, who is the head of the Catholic Church, has actually made very clear the Catholic Church's position on the death penalty. And it is that the death penalty must be abolished, right? In 2018, he revised the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, which is a manual that's used for teaching Catholics worldwide, and he describes the death penalty as an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and it is inadmissible in all cases. Pope Francis says there can be no stepping back from this position. Today, we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. And this is the highest authority in the Catholic Church.
I'll chime in there because the World Council of Churches also made a declaration in 1990 that the death penalty in taking away a human life, the state asserts the will of God and recommends that governments abolish the death penalty and rectify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Okay, thank you, Ching Wei and Miak. So